chapter 14, verses 1 through 14. This is found on page 1012 if you're using the Bibles in the back of the pews. Luke 14, 1 through 14, a story of Jesus sitting at the table of a prominent Pharisee. One Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. There in front of him was a man suffering from dropsy. Jesus asked the Pharisees and experts in the law, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" But they remained silent. So taking hold of the man, he healed him and sent him away. Then he asked them, "If one of you has a son or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull him out?" And they had nothing to say. When he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. "When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, 'Give this man your seat.' Then, humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. But when you're invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, 'Friend, move up to a better place.' Then you'll be honored in the presence of all your fellow guests. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." Then Jesus said to his host, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you'll be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Have you ever found yourself in one of those social settings or situations where you've broken some social norm, some social rule, and it gets super awkward and embarrassing, and you realize that you've done something, some kind of faux pas? Maybe you get red in the face, feeling embarrassed. You want to hide, disappear somehow, crawl into a hole. We say you feel mortified, right? Because you'd rather die than live through such an embarrassment. And if you've never felt that yourself, then likely your spouse or a close friend has felt it on your behalf when you committed some social blunder. Because we do that too. Sometimes it works that way. Sometimes we feel embarrassment even for someone else, or just when we're involved in a situation where a norm is broken, where someone's clearly broken the rules. I had this happen to me when I was out to dinner with a group. We'd gone out because someone had won this Visa gift card. And so they were like, "Hey, I want to take you guys all out for dinner on this gift card." So we enjoyed a good meal and everything, but when it came time to actually pay for the meal, the server took the card and tried to run it, but it didn't work. So the guy who had won this card, he insisted, "Try it again. I just won this card. I know it has money on it, so go ahead, try it again." But it still wouldn't work. And now it was a pretty big bill, and we wouldn't have gone out if it weren't for this gift card. But the server said that, "I'm going to need some other form of payment." And so that got this guy kind of riled up, right? A little bit indignant. He's like, "This is a Visa gift card. On your door, you say you accept Visa. This is legal tender. This is your responsibility to figure this out, get this thing to work." So that got the server kind of tense, and then the rest of us are kind of feeling the tension rise, escalate just a little bit. Soon enough, a manager gets involved over at the table, and I begin to feel a little embarrassed about this. I'm not involved in the conversation. I haven't said anything, but I feel embarrassed because even though I agree that the restaurant really should be able to figure this out, they've run gift cards before, I'm sure they should, this is their responsibility to figure it out. It feels like a social rule has been broken here. It feels like we can push back a little bit against servers, but you don't want to cause a scene, right? You don't yell, and even getting a manager seems like it's going a little far. Maybe we should just deal with it, suck it up, and each split the payment or something like that. It feels like we've broken some rule, and we were way past the point of what was considered appropriate in terms of pushing back on this server. And we tend to operate in our world with rules like that. Social constructs like that. They govern us. They kind of corral us to behave a certain sort of way. And in our passage that we've read this morning, there's a similar situation. There's a meal, and there's a guest who doesn't have much regard for those social constructs, those unwritten rules about how you ought to behave. The scene begins with a meal on the Sabbath, in the house of a prominent Pharisee, one of the leading Pharisees. Dun, dun, dun. For us, this should register some sort of tension that there's something coming here. Luke has trained us by now, if we're reading his gospel, to watch for these situations. As soon as we see meal, Pharisee, Sabbath, we know that something is coming. The last time Jesus had a meal with the Pharisees, they'd been determined to catch him in something that he was going to say. And so, of course, at this meal, we read that the Pharisees watch Jesus closely, carefully. Imagine then Jesus reclining at this table of this leading Pharisee for a meal. And not just any meal, it's the Sabbath meal. Carried a little more celebration, a little more gravitas. You'd invite perhaps a few more guests than normal. So as all the guests recline at the table, suddenly this man with dropsy shows up. Had he just wandered into the house? Possibly. Open doors provided relatively easy access to the courtyards at that time. Had he been placed there? Had the Pharisees planted this man there? Regardless of those circumstances, when Jesus saw the man, he asked all of the guests, these upstanding Pharisees, these teachers of the law, whether it was lawful to heal on the Sabbath. Hearing no reply, Jesus grabbed the man and heals him right there. Right there. Now let's not assume that the Pharisees and teachers didn't want this man to be healed at all. It's not as if they preferred for this man to be sick and to have dropsy forever. Let's consider what Jesus really did here. It's only one chapter before, in chapter 13, verse 14, that Jesus heard the synagogue leaders specifically say, there are 6 days for work, so come and be healed on one of those days, not on the Sabbath. And in spite of that, Jesus still asked this question, already knowing the answer, whether or not it's permissible to heal on the Sabbath. And he asks it more as a challenge, a bit of a rude thing to do, to challenge your host, and especially when you already know what the answer is going to be, especially when these people are just trying to follow the Sabbath rules. They're just following the social norm, the social construct for their day, the way things are supposed to go. How hard would it have been, really, for Jesus to simply wait a few hours to heal this man? This was an afternoon meal, and the Sabbath ended at 6 p.m., so in a maximum of 6 hours, Jesus could heal this man without offending the social construct at all. This man had lived with dropsy for years. What would a few hours matter? And to blatantly disobey Sabbath law like that is no minor thing. It was offensive. Socially embarrassing to witness this sort of thing, much less to be a part of it. So witnesses would be mortified by what they saw. Jesus, completely unfazed. He was not concerned with their propriety or his own, for that matter. Indeed, Jesus went on to make even more of a scene as we read. Everyone knew that society develops a sort of social hierarchy for everyone based on your importance or your wealth. And accordingly, certain seats at the meal would be for those of a certain standing within that hierarchy, depending where you fell. So meals were used to reinforce that social hierarchy. So finding an appropriate seat at a meal was important. One would want to take as high a seat as possible without actually overreaching, lest what Jesus described happen. You get kicked down to a lower seat because someone else comes who's more important. And so Jesus watched this very normal jockeying for seats unfold, and he calls it out explicitly. Again, as a guest in the house, Jesus asserted himself, creating an embarrassing situation for all of those involved. And he didn't stop there. Next, he quite explicitly suggested that the host ought not to have invited all of these wealthy friends and relatives. They would just invite you back and they would repay you. But the status of the guests at your dinner party was not inconsequential. There was some social currency to be gained by having the right sort of people at your dinner party. But Jesus rejected that whole socio-political game. Don't even consult the ledger on people when you put a guest list together. None of that even matters. In fact, just invite all the worst sort of people you can. The sort of people who will never invite you back to their own place. Jesus put on a completely mortifying display of disregard for the social constructs of his day. Not just a faux pas. Jesus committed complete social blunder here. The Jews had a way of living. They had a way of observing their laws, of maintaining social order through their hierarchies, and a way of knowing where they stood against other people in society. And Jesus looked all of that up and down. Useless. And this is a dangerous thing for the Pharisees and teachers. Even dangerous for the whole society. Someone like that is dangerous. Someone who has no concern for the way of life, for the way things are, the way that things are supposed to go. Someone with such blatant disregard for the social constructs, that person's a wild card. Who knows what they would do? They'd be completely unpredictable. They're playing life by a totally different set of rules. And so that's the threat to stability, to propriety. But Jesus was just not concerned with the glue of the social constructs that held their lives together. And that reality remains the same even today. We may have our own social constructs built up. We may be troubled by some of the things that Jesus says and does because they're mortifying. They fly in the face of social etiquette. What rules have we applied to our own day of worship that Jesus would completely and perhaps even intentionally disregard? What of our rules and policies do we have in our own Christian communities that Jesus would balk at because of their disregard for one of his image bearers? For instance, Christian communities and churches that have policies or just have norms of how they operate that aren't equipped to engage those who are mentally ill or perhaps the physically impaired. It'd be too much of a nuisance to figure out how to serve and how to incorporate them, so instead they're simply ignored. We can let someone else care for them. Or take those churches that don't know how to engage with those who have been divorced, and so would rather just bar them and say, you know what, we have a rule about that, so you can't really belong. Or churches that would do the same thing to someone who's same-sex attracted. Jesus is troubling to us in these situations because we know the sorts of people that he spent time with, the people that he invited in. And it's not that we don't want healing for those people. It's not that we don't want restoration or we don't want reconciliation to happen, but we just want them to happen within the bound of our rules, of our norms. In some Christian communities, part of the social construct, the expectation will be that you hold to a right-wing political ideology. In others, the expectation will be that you hold to a left-wing political ideology. And it'll be part of the fabric that keeps the community together. We're all supposed to toe the line and agree on all of these things together. And Jesus is especially troubling in either of these situations because he refuses to toe any party line. He will point out the ridiculous idea of giving our allegiance to a political ideology of this world. And what's more, he would audaciously claim all of that allegiance go to him. He'd look at the political powers in our world, size them up, and say, useless. Just like the Jewish culture at the time of our story, our own culture establishes social hierarchies as well. And we reestablish these hierarchies by the sorts of social events that we attend, just like them. And so many in our own world also jockey for social currency by trying to get the right seat at the right table, climbing the ladder, as they say. And so we can fall prey to the temptation for power and for relevance. We can get caught up in the concern of our own public appearance and simply follow along with the social constructs as they exist, because to live outside of those norms is weird. It's embarrassing. It's mortifying. But how can we know which of our own constructs are the ones that would be upended by Jesus? What's the glue that holds our lives together that Jesus is just not concerned with? How can we discern what those are? The first place to look will be at those parts of Jesus' life and of Christian faith that make us feel uncomfortable. The parts that we feel embarrassed about. Those parts of Jesus' teaching that we sort of just brush over and we make excuses for them or justify them away. Those are likely an indication of our adherence to some social construct. A second place to look is at the customs in our lives that disconnect us from the humanity of other people. In what ways do we overlook the humanity of the man with dropsy, the mentally ill, the divorcee, the same-sex attracted individual, or whoever else, for the sake of maintaining stability in our social order? A third place to look will be to follow the trail of power. Because those who have power are most likely to lose from a change in the status quo. They have something to lose. So Jesus is a threat to those at the top of the social hierarchy because he doesn't play by their rules, nor does he acknowledge their power as real or legitimate. And to what end, then, did Jesus upset these customs? Was his purpose just to get under the skin of these teachers and Pharisees, just to annoy them? Well, it's clear that there's a theme in the sorts of customs that Jesus upset throughout all of Luke's gospel, and even here in this short story that we've read. The first case here showed the Pharisees and teachers that Jesus was willing to upset their customs for the sake of the sick. Now, the man with dropsy was not only sick, but would also have been considered an outcast in the society. When someone had a disease like that, it was often presumed that he or his family had committed some grave sin for such misfortune to come upon him. But Jesus wasn't willing to embarrass the social protocol and the rules of the Sabbath for the sake of this outcast, this sick sinner. And the second case that showed that Jesus has this preference for the humble. Rather than seeking positions of power, Jesus would thumb his nose at worldly power and was willing to embarrass the social hierarchy for the humble. And the third case showed that Jesus was not concerned with what people could provide him. He wasn't interested in playing social games of importance. He wasn't concerned with associating with the right sort of people. He was willing to embarrass the social order for the sake of the poor, for those who had nothing to offer. And these were not the only messages that Jesus communicated to the Pharisees or to the readers of this story. By rejecting these customs, these rules and constructs, he also then invited his listeners into this new life. He invited his listeners into a liberated life. One commentator described Jesus' invitation this way, that it was to be liberated from fear of embarrassment, of being mortified. He invited them to be free from conformity to civility and all of its manners, to live a life free of concern for the opinion that society might have of them. Not only regarding the petty laws and customs, but even regarding the pursuit for power and prestige. It was a crazy invitation, really. Jesus' invitation was to live outside of the status quo. outside of the normal construct. So by definition, this invitation is to be unique. It's to be distinct, to be different. But the theologian Robert Capon, he made a good observation about being unique. He said this: the trouble with uniqueness is that practically no one can see it as anything but craziness. And perhaps they would have been right. Jesus' way does seem crazy. It goes completely against the normal pattern for life. Somehow Jesus was not afraid at all of the things that would mortify your average person. It sounds nice not to have to worry about power or perception or all of those things, but how did Jesus get there? Now, the way that Luke has told his story and told this gospel, it gives us some indication. Jesus has had his face set towards Jerusalem since chapter 9. We read in chapter 9 that Jesus set his face toward Jerusalem, and he's heading that way for the rest of the book. Jesus has predicted his death twice already. And right before this encounter in chapter 14 that we've read, Jesus again made it clear that he was headed toward Jerusalem. And not only toward Jerusalem, but he was headed toward his death. Jesus had been told to leave where he was staying because Herod wanted to kill him, but his response was one of disregard or even contempt. Jesus said this: "Go and tell that fox, I'll keep on driving out demons and healing people today and tomorrow, and on the third day I will reach my goal." No prophet can die outside of Jerusalem. Jesus was headed toward his death. The way of Jesus led to a death. Jesus was not afraid of the embarrassment of upsetting some social protocol. Such a thing would not mortify him at all. Why would it? Here was a man who was intentionally walking towards his own literal mortification. He walked towards his literal death. He had no time for social rioting. Did the Pharisees pick up the subtleties of his invitation to take the last seat, the eschaton, a reference to the final days and the final judgment? An invitation to be less concerned about the wedding feasts of today and more concerned about the final banquet that would come, the one that we would pass through death to attend. Now, there's a certain grace in Jesus' invitation that extends to us today. Clearly, for those of us who find ourselves outcast by society for whatever reason, we find grace in Jesus. You feel like an outcast for some physical reason, for personality reasons, for reasons having to do with your past, for reasons that have to do with your questions. Those of us who feel like we cannot fit in neatly to this cookie-cutter mold that our community seems to want, Jesus would rather forget about the glue of our social networks and risk embarrassment to bring you healing. For those of us who are caught up in the exhausting race for social power and currency, we find grace in Jesus. Do you feel pressure to make it to a certain standing? Do you find your self-worth by looking up and down the table to see who it is you're sitting ahead of, or who you might be sitting behind? Do you find yourself grasping for control in life by holding on tightly to as much power as you can get your hands on? Jesus invites us to scorn the status of the world, to disregard the levels of status, to just not care about them, and to sit ourselves in the last place, in the least place. And he invites us to find our worth in the exaltation that God will give us on the day of our death, when we meet him. For those of us who find ourselves using relationships with other people as a means to get ahead in some way, we also find grace in Jesus. Are you tempted to seek out the important and wealthy and and reputable people, and to make relationship with them that will just be good for your own interests and business? Do you find yourself consulting a ledger on people to see where they stand before determining whether or not it's worth you investing time in them? Jesus invites us to ledger down, to not worry about society's opinion of us or to worry whether we'll be repaid or be taken advantage of. There is no sense in us keeping records on one another when the God of all creation does not keep a record against us. And this is the ultimate grace of Jesus, that he invites us to his final banquet. And he's done the very thing that he taught in this text. He disregarded the embarrassment and the shame of the cross in order to bring healing, in order to bring reconciliation for us, for people who were in such a sinful state that we couldn't be in the presence of God. And he became the shamed one. He became the outcast one. And Jesus took the absolute lowest place. He left his rightful seat, sitting at the right hand of God in the throne, to humble himself and to this lowest place, to come to earth not only as a human, but as a helpless baby. And Jesus will throw a huge banquet. And those that he invites, they're not his equals, nor are they his betters. He invites the likes of you and me. And we cannot pay him back. He knows that. He's the generous host who does not consult a ledger on our lives to see where we stack up against his perfection, or even to see where we stack up against one another. So whoever we are, whether the poor and outcast of society, or whether we're those who are fighting for control and power and status, Jesus invites us into saving life through the doorway of death. That is through his death. He invites us to attach our lives to him so that we would die with him, but also so that we would rise with him. So that on the final day, the day of resurrection and judgment, our God will look at us and see the righteousness of the one to whom we have committed our lives, Jesus Christ. So thanks be to God the Father, his Son Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Join me in prayer. God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, our triune God, we give you thanks for your love, for your grace, and for your care. We are people who do not deserve it. We are people who struggle through life, who fail. We are people who wonder how we can hold on to power, how we can become greater. But teach us the way of your Son, who humbled himself, who did not consider the opinion of the world something that mattered, but instead humbled himself and became the shamed, the outcast one on our behalf. So, Holy Spirit, would you fill us with love and grace for one another as well, that we'd be the hands and feet